At pivotal moments in modern Syrian history, Bashar al-Assad's regime has been marked by extensive controversy and contradictions. While it was promoted as a symbol of stability, behind the scenes, it bore responsibility for numerous crimes and violations that left a lasting and indelible impact on the Syrian people. However, with the outbreak of the Syrian Revolution in 2011, the mask this regime had long worn began to collapse, revealing the true brutality that lay beneath. In this video, we will examine the most prominent military and security figures considered among the butchers of the Assad regime, delving into details that may be unknown to many about the horrific crimes they committed. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel to receive all the latest updates. The beginning of the Assad family's control over Syria dates back to 1970, when Hafez al-Assad seized power through a bloody military coup while serving as Syria's Minister of Defense. At the time, Hafez al-Assad was able to strike a decisive blow against his political rivals and exploit both domestic and international political circumstances to his advantage. Following the success of the coup, he established an authoritarian regime that relied primarily on the security and military apparatus to consolidate and maintain power. He quickly reinforced the family's control over state institutions, granting extensive loyalty and privileges to the security services and the army by forming alliances with military and intelligence leaders. As a result, these institutions became the backbone of the Syrian political system. Hafez al-Assad's rule was not without horrific crimes against the Syrian people, most notably the Hama massacre of 1982, considered one of the most brutal acts of repression in modern Syrian history. The uprising of local residents against the regime was met with extreme violence by Syrian army forces, who made excessive use of heavy weaponry. These operations resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, leaving a deep and lasting mark on the collective memory of Syrians regarding the regime's cruelty and bloodshed. In the year 2000, after a long struggle with illness, Hafez al-Assad died and was succeeded by his son, Bashar al-Assad. Bashar presented himself to the world as a young reformer who had come to bring change to the Syrian system, promising to develop political and economic life in Syria. At the beginning of his rule, he allowed limited political freedoms in an attempt to ease international pressure on the regime. However, these reforms proved to be extremely superficial and failed to meet the aspirations of the Syrian people. It soon became clear that his promises were nothing more than slogans intended to deceive public opinion, as the regime continued to employ the same tools of repression established by his father. The security services remained responsible for arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings, which led to growing domestic opposition and contributed to the outbreak of popular protests. In 2011, popular protests erupted across Syria as part of the broader Arab movement that swept through many countries in the region during the so-called Arab Spring. Syrians took to the streets in peaceful demonstrations, demanding political and economic reform and the achievement of public freedoms. As the number of protesters grew in cities across the country, the regime's response became increasingly violent and brutal. Bashar al-Assad resorted to excessive military force to suppress the protests, deploying armed forces equipped with heavy weapons and artillery shelling against demonstrators. This resulted in the deaths and injuries of large numbers of civilians. The conflict soon escalated from peaceful protests into a bloody civil war, during which the regime used warplanes and indiscriminate bombardment of residential areas, leading to widespread destruction of homes and infrastructure. This brutal repression fueled public anger and transformed the revolution into a prolonged conflict involving numerous domestic and international actors, further complicating the situation in Syria. Maher al-Assad, commander of the 4th Division, is considered one of the most prominent military figures within the Syrian regime, having played a central role in the systematic repression of civilians. The 4th Division, which he commanded, is regarded as an elite unit within the Syrian army, directly affiliated with the regime and characterized by extreme loyalty to it. This made the division closely linked to numerous brutal massacres, particularly in areas such as Homs and Daraa, where heavy and chemical weapons were used to suppress peaceful demonstrations. Among the most notorious crimes attributed to Maher al-Assad is the Eastern Ghouta massacre in 2013, during which the regime used chemical weapons against civilians, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of people, including children. This massacre became one of the worst humanitarian tragedies of the Syrian war and prompted widespread international condemnation. He was also responsible for the siege of Homs, during which the regime imposed a suffocating blockade on the city, leading to the starvation of civilians and deprivation of basic necessities. This siege resulted in the deaths of many residents due to shortages of food and medicine, as part of a sustained policy of military pressure. On the other hand, Ali Mamlouk, head of Syria's National Security Bureau, is considered one of the most prominent security figures involved in strengthening the regime's repression of internal opposition. His name has been closely associated with arbitrary arrests, torture, and mass executions. He became particularly notorious through his role in overseeing Syria prison, which has become a symbol of human rights violations in Syria. He directly supervised torture practices and mass executions targeting thousands of detainees in what is considered one of the world's worst prisons. Numerous documented cases reveal the scale of atrocities committed by the regime against political prisoners. He is also accused of overseeing enforced disappearances of thousands of individuals who were abducted from their homes or workplaces without leaving any trace, constituting a flagrant violation of civil and human rights. Meanwhile, Jamil Hassan, head of the Air Force Intelligence Directorate, was among the most prominent officials responsible for torture and enforced disappearance in Syria. His agency was regarded as one of the most dangerous security services involved in abuses against detainees and Syrian civilians. His name has been linked to what became known as the human slaughterhouses in prisons, where thousands of opposition figures were tortured and executed. Among the crimes attributed to him is overseeing the executions at Syria prison, where approximately 13,000 detainees were secretly executed without trial. In addition, he played a major role in indiscriminate aerial bombardment targeting residential areas across Syrian cities using warplanes, resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians. This bombing campaign constituted a systematic policy aimed at destroying cities and forcing their inhabitants to surrender. In addition, pro-regime Shabiha militias formed a fundamental part of the regime's repression machinery, committing numerous brutal crimes against civilians in areas under regime control. These militias were used as a tool to crush opposition and impose the regime's authority by force. Their crimes included killing, looting, and rape in rebellious areas, with such atrocities carried out in a horrifying manner while benefiting from full regime support, allowing them to commit acts of violence without any legal accountability. The crimes committed by the butchers of the Assad regime are among the most horrific atrocities Syria has witnessed over decades. The brutality of this regime was manifested in a series of savage acts targeting civilians and opposition figures alike. In 1982, Rifa'at al-Assad, the uncle of Bashar al-Assad, led a brutal military operation against the city of Hama, with the aim of crushing the popular uprising that erupted as a result of escalating repression of Syrian society. Syrian armed forces employed excessive military force, bombarding residential neighborhoods with heavy artillery and warplanes. This assault resulted in the deaths of an estimated 10,000 to 40,000 people, many of them innocent civilians. The attack came to be known as an act of genocide, as the forces made no distinction between combatants and civilians and nearly destroyed the city entirely, thereby consolidating the regime's iron grip on power. On August 21, 2013, Eastern Ghouta, one of the main opposition strongholds in the Damascus countryside, witnessed another horrific massacre. The Syrian regime used chemical weapons, launching toxic gases such as sarin into densely populated civilian areas, killing hundreds of people, including many children and women. The objective of this attack was to terrorize civilians and force them into submission. This assault is attributed to the efforts of Maher al-Assad, commander of the 4th Division, which played a key role in carrying out chemical weapons attacks. The massacre sparked widespread international outrage, with calls from the United Nations and the international community to hold those responsible accountable. Syrian prison, located north of Damascus, is regarded as one of the worst prisons in the world in terms of human rights violations. It has become a symbol of the brutal torture practices carried out by the Syrian regime against political detainees and opposition figures. Under the supervision of Ali Mamlouk, head of Syria's National Security Bureau, and in coordination with other security forces, numerous cases of torture and summary executions were documented. Detainees were deprived of food and water and subjected to various forms of physical and psychological torture, leading to the deaths of thousands. Among the most notorious attacks carried out by the regime was the Khan Sheikhoun attack in April 2017, when regime warplanes targeted the town of Khan Sheikhoun in the Idlib countryside with deadly sarin gas. This attack killed dozens of civilians, most of whom were children and women. Despite widespread international condemnation, the regime continued to use these internationally banned weapons against other areas, triggering political tensions at the global level and leading Western countries to impose sanctions on the Syrian regime. The regime also imposed severe sieges on several Syrian cities, such as Homs and Daraa, as part of its war against the opposition, seeking to force residents into surrender through starvation and the weakening of armed resistance. These sieges lasted for months, during which civilians were denied access to basic necessities such as food and medicine. As a result, many people died from hunger or diseases caused by the lack of medical care. Forces of the 4th Division, led by Maher al-Assad, were responsible for enforcing these harsh sieges, which rank among the most brutal methods of warfare used by the regime against the Syrian people. These policies left long-term psychological and physical effects on civilians in besieged areas, further deepening their suffering. Since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, the United Nations and its specialized bodies, such as the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, have undertaken the task of documenting the grave human rights violations committed by the Assad regime against civilians. Survivor testimonies, along with reports and techniques such as satellite imagery analysis and digital data collection, have helped build case files implicating the Syrian regime. These reports have highlighted in particular the use of chemical weapons against civilians, including the attack on Eastern Ghouta, as well as the widespread torture carried out inside Syrian prisons and detention centers such as Syrian prison. The investigations confirmed that the Syrian regime, under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad and senior officials around him, bears responsibility for these crimes. However, despite ongoing documentation, United Nations investigations have failed to result in effective international accountability due to the political complexities surrounding the Syrian issue. As a result of these continued violations, many Western countries imposed economic and political sanctions on prominent figures within the Syrian regime. Among the most notable individuals targeted were Maher al-Assad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad, and Ali Mamlouk, head of the National Security Bureau. These sanctions included asset freezes, travel bans, and measures targeting companies and entities linked to these individuals, in an attempt to cut off the regime's sources of funding and limit its ability to continue its repressive policies. The European Union and the United States were among the leading actors in imposing these sanctions. Nevertheless, despite their impact on certain levels of the regime, the effectiveness of these measures remained limited due to the military and economic support the regime continues to receive from its allies, particularly Russia and Iran. Despite extensive documentation of crimes and violations committed by the Syrian regime, the International Criminal Court has been unable to take legal action against key Syrian officials. This is primarily due to Russia and China's use of their veto power in the United Nations Security Council, as both countries have blocked any attempt to refer the Syrian case to the ICC. This political obstruction, rooted in Moscow's and Beijing's strategic and diplomatic interests in supporting the Syrian regime, has made accountability for senior Syrian leaders for war crimes virtually impossible, and has generated widespread international frustration regarding justice and accountability. In conclusion, as the Syrian regime eventually collapses, international efforts to hold those responsible for the committed crimes have intensified. Despite political obstacles, ongoing international initiatives continue to seek effective mechanisms for justice and accountability, whether through trials or alternative legal pathways, in an effort to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable and brought to justice. This brings us to the end of today's video. Don't miss out on future content. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell to stay updated with all our latest releases.